So I have the pleasure to introduce a speaker tonight. Eleanor Heartney is a contributing editor of Art in America and Art Press, and has written extensively on contemporary art for various publications, including Art News and the New York Times. I can say without hesitation that Heartney is one of the finest writers on art today. She has written several books on art and politics, religion, postmodernism, and other pressing issues. She is, to my mind, one of the very few people who can discuss art as an integral part of our social and political existence from a deep understanding of contemporary art and how artists think and work, and how their work affects and is affected by the world we live in. She is one of only a handful of writers who I always read, whatever the topic is, because it is important to see what she thinks and has to say, even if I had no particular interest in the topic before. These are my evaluations, but I'm confirmed by great awards that Heartney has received, including the College Art Association's Frank Jewett Mather Award for Distinction in Art Criticism, and the prestigious Order of Arts and Letters, which is awarded by the French government in recognition of significant contribution to the arts. Eleanor Heartney is the first participant in the Talk, Lecture and Visitors series, which is a collaborative lecture program of the Reykjavik Art Museum, the Icelandic Art Center, and the Icelandic Academy of the Arts. The program is intended to offer an ongoing platform for encounters with art professionals internationally. It has been great to work with Aðalheiður Guðmundsdóttir, Dorothea Courage, and Kristín Dagmar Jóhannsdóttir on this project, and I'm thrilled with the outcome because we have 4 leading writers and curators coming to Iceland in the next few months to give lectures, talk to art students, and meet artists. Beside Eleanor Heartney, the participants are Claire Bishop, Helen Molesworth, and Alana Heiss. This program is sponsored by the American Embassy in Iceland, which has been very generous. It is certainly one of the most difficult things that the institutions that have come together to organize this program have to face since our famous financial crash, is to fund international programs because of the condition of the krona. But it is essential to develop, for the development of art, that it maintains a conversation with the larger world, and it is essential to Reykjavik, as it is to any city that wants to maintain thriving art scene. Therefore, the support of the American Embassy is much appreciated. And it's wonderful to have Eleanor Heartney here to start this conversation. Please go.
Okay. I feel very elevated here. Okay. Thank you, Hafbor, and thanks also to the American Embassy and to everyone who was involved in bringing me here. And I also want to thank the gods of weather for giving me an experience of Iceland that is exactly what I expected it to be, although from what I understand, it is not completely normal. So thanks to all. So today I thought that it would be interesting, because the Santiago Sierra show is up in the museum right now, to talk about some of the issues that that show raises about the relationship between artists and labor. One of the things that I think this very interesting show illustrates is how very complex and complicated and in many ways contradictory that relationship is. So I thought it would be interesting to start with a little history. here. As it turns out, right now at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, there's a Diego Rivera show. And it's an exhibition of some of the murals that he brought to New York in 1931 to the Museum of Modern Art. So it's a kind of reprise of that show. This, of course, was the exhibition that just preceded the very famous or infamous painting of the mural that he did for Rockefeller Center that was then painted over because he had put an image of Lenin into the mural. But the images that are in the exhibition at MoMA preceded that. And it's a very interesting show. First of all, he brought over, he was just beginning to be known, actually, in the United States, and he brought over some portable murals, which, as you can see here, present his very Marxist notion of the relationship between labor and management. And here you see, kind of lots of images of kind of exploitation and, the managers sort of lolling about or kind of basically torturing the workers. Another work that's in this exhibition is this one, suggesting an uprising of workers. So it was a series of images, and of course this was, in 1931, this was just after the Depression had hit, in the middle of in fact, the Depression, a time when these kinds of issues were very pertinent in the United States. And after coming to America, he decided that he would also do some images that were, some paintings that were based on his experiences in New York. And these are also in the show. This is one here, this is called Pneumatic Drilling. He was fascinated by all of the work that was going on. And of course, this was partly because of the WPA in New York at the time, the works program that was instituted by the government to put people back to work during this period of very high unemployment. And he was also interested in the way in which these works projects were being done to sort of basically change the fabric of the city. And so some of them are kind of these very heroic images of workers. Here's another one. This one is called Electric Power. And here underneath the city, you see up above, some of the generators, and down below are the workers who are starting to put together the power grid in New York City. But he also included this image, which is called Frozen Assets, which was a very critical image, and I think revealed much more than the others do his politics and how he applied it to what was happening in the United States. So this is a image, and on the top level, it has 3 levels. On the top level, you see the city as it's beginning to be formed here with all the skyscrapers, becoming the New York that we know today. The middle level are all of the workers who are putting this together, involved in the construction. They have no place to live, so they are here just lined up in sort of barrack style, sleeping during the night so they can get up in the morning and do the work. And then the lowest level then is the bank vault and the people then who are profiting from this. So one of the points of this painting is, of course, the huge gap between the wealthy and the workers. And this, of course, is a subject which doesn't seem to go away. Moving now to Occupy Wall Street, which just this last fall sort of consumed New York and was as I'm sure you are aware, was what began as a somewhat spontaneous gathering of a very disparate group of people, many students, unemployed workers, even homeless people, and they moved into one of the parks just adjacent to Wall Street and were there for, I think, about 2 months before they were finally rousted. And they had a variety of grievances, but certainly one of them had to do with jobs. I have several images from that here. And so in a certain way, kind of suggesting that there is this continuity between our time and that of 1931 when Diego Rivera came him. But of course, at the same time, the world's very different now as well. and the issues of labor and work are very different. And a number of the things that, of course, have changed now and were not in place at the time that Diego Rivera was working, first of all, are the way in which so much of manufacturing and production has become mechanized, so that machines, have rendered many of what used to be very high-skilled factory jobs, kind of things that he was illustrating in his paintings. They've become superfluous. And as productivity goes up, it doesn't necessarily translate into any gains for the workers because of that. The other thing, of course, that is new to our world that was not happening then, it was the way in which globalization has created this enormous shift in manufacturing away from the developed world and towards the undeveloped world, particularly in the form of outsourcing and the way in which jobs, the good jobs move elsewhere and become not good jobs when they go to other countries. And this then has led to this decline in the power of the unions, which were still in the 30s a very powerful entity in American and I think world culture. But now as fewer and fewer people belong to unions, and as in fact the kinds of jobs that unions protect disappear, they have become more and more marginalized. So what happens then is that there has been this basic change in the nature of work. And so not only, I read an interesting statistic recently which said that in the United States today, only 9% of the jobs are in manufacturing. And of course that explains why that suddenly unions are not as important. And it also, I think, explains this whole notion that in Diego Rivera's day, there was an idea that the factory was sort of the defining mode of labor. But that's not the case anymore. There are actually very few factory jobs in America. Instead, unskilled workers, instead of being able to hope to get a good job in Detroit and a paying job and move into the middle class, are often confined to the service sector, and what they call from blue-collar jobs to pink-collar jobs, because these used to be the jobs that women had, and are much less well-paid, have much fewer protections, things like working at Walmart and jobs like that. And the other kind of big shift is that even for workers who are skilled in the developed world, they have found a shift in their work as well, and the rise of what is sometimes called the net slave. And the net slave, then, is an information worker who has no protections, no security, and no limit on the amount of work and hours that he has to do. You always have your computer or your iPhone with you, so in a sense, you're always on call. So the question is that I want to address here, how do artists today deal with these kinds of issues? Clearly, the kind of work that Diego Rivera did doesn't seem relevant anymore. And interestingly, there was recently a show at Mass MoCA in Massachusetts, which is it's a small it's a town that was sustained for many years by a factory. The factory went bust, and the town was really very impoverished until they moved a big exhibition program there, and now it has a big museum. And so culture, has sort of replaced factory work in this town. And because of that, the exhibition organizers decided to look at this question of work today and how do artists deal with work. And one of the things that I thought was very interesting about this show, and I'll be showing some works from that show as well as some other things here, is the sense that in many cases, the artists seem to not be, they exhibit a kind of sense of disconnection from the worker. I mean, there's almost a kind of nostalgic look back at factory work, or if they talk about labor, it's something that is alien in a way to the art world. And as I'm going to argue here, that's one of the things that is so interesting about Santiago Sierra, is that he doesn't allow that sort of disconnect to happen. So I thought I'd just kind of run through some of the ways that artists today seem to be dealing with this issue of labor. One of the things that many artists choose to deal with is globalism's impact on labor. And as I was mentioning before, this has created this massive shift in where work is done and how it's done and how it gets compensated. This is a work actually that was in the Workers show, and it's a video work by the video artist pair Funari and Della Torre. And it's a documentary called Maquilapolis, which is about the maquiladora workers in Mexico. And this is a phenomenon that has happened post-NAFTA in the United States, when the kind of borders between Mexico and the United States were opened for trade. And what happened was that many, kind of formerly decent factory jobs were driven just south of the border, so they're just on the Mexican side of the border, and of course much less well paid, without union or any kind of wage protections. And this film was about some of the worker activists who are part of this phenomenon. And one of the things that's interesting about this film, it's a long and very kind of dense and intense film, is that much of it was filmed by the workers themselves, talking about their situation. And for many of them, what their situation is that all night long they're making television components. You see some of them here. And then they come home at night to a shack that's built out of recycled garage doors. So there's this huge kind of disconnect. And the film focuses in particular on two activists. This is one of them. This is Carmen, who challenged the television manufacturer for labor violations. The other, I think not a picture of the other worker, but this is actually the factory that she's working in. The other worker who is focused on in this film is Lourdes, who pressured the government to clean toxic waste dump that was left by the departing factory. And the irony, of course, is in the process, while this film was being filmed, the 2008 financial crisis happened, and even many of these bad jobs were relocated to China. So it's a kind of the film becomes a record of this kind of downward spiral that seems to be caused by globalization. Another documentary, and this was also in the Workers show, is by the documentary filmmaker Oliver Ressler. And the title kind of sums up what it's about. The title is "Socialism Failed, Capitalism is Bankrupt, What Comes Next?" So in a sense, this is about the legacy of the end of the Cold War. And it's a documentation of bizarre workers in post-Soviet Armenia. And many of these are people who once had good jobs and security and certain kinds of protections in the Soviet era. And with the end of the Soviet Union, they lost their safety net. And now they have to eke out their living in the bazaar. And here's a... it has many kind of interviews with people there talking about how difficult it is. And part of what you get from this film is a sense that of huge frustration that there's a feeling that democracy has failed and that the free market has simply resulted in the creation of a huge income gap between the rich and the poor, which reawakens the pro-Soviet feeling. So again, creating a very dangerous situation. Another approach that is taken by artists dealing with the issue of labor is simply to look at factory life, both in the developed and the undeveloped world. As an example of kind of an artist who looks at factory life in the developed world, this is a piece, this is again a video. It's interesting that almost all the works that I found kind of dealing with this issue are video works. Although they, as you'll see, take it in kind of very different directions. This is by Sharon Lockhart, and it's called Lunch Break. And this was filmed at the Bath Iron Works, which is a shipyard and U.S. Navy supplier in Bath, Maine. And this is still, fortunately, operational. And so basically what she does in this film is to evoke the factory experience, or actually the kind of downtime. So she moves the camera very, very slowly through the corridors. It's just almost infinitesimal when you watch this film. And it's during the lunch break, so the workers here are kind of resting, amid the machinery. Let's see, we have another image of it here, you know, having their lunch. And in a certain way, it's a kind of almost nostalgic image, because this is the kind of factory work and these are the kinds of jobs that seem to be disappearing so quickly. And yet here, you know, there is this kind of sense that it's still hidden away. There are pockets where these kinds of jobs exist. This work in Mass MoCA was paired with another one, which tells a different part of the story. This is called Exit. And this is, again, a very slow-moving image, but it's a slow-moving video of the workers as they leave the plant. And it feels like a metaphor also for sort of the notion of these jobs themselves, sort of leaving the kind of America and the Western Hemisphere for China. So there's something kind of, especially in the slow motion, it's very elegiac. Now, the question is then, what happens to the place where the jobs have gone? And that's the subject of this work by Cao Fei, who was a Chinese artist. The work is called Whose Utopia? And this was filmed at a light bulb factory in China's Pearl River Delta in Guangdong. This is the place where much of China's industrial boom has taken place. And it's an interesting film because it starts out in a kind of very documentary way. It has sort of two different sections. So first, you kind of follow the light bulbs and the workers through the mechanized production process. You see kind of here are the light bulbs going down a conveyor belt. You see here, you know, the very kind of close work that the workers have to do. And then this is followed by a second section, which is called Factory Fairytale. And in this part of the video, the workers are still working, but all of a sudden it's musicians and dancers and all kinds of sort of artistic figures kind of break out here. Here you see the dancer. And they keep working as if they're sort of not really noticing it as these things are happening. And sort of part of the point here, of course, is what's going on inside the head of these people who are doing these kind of mind-numbingly repetitive jobs over and over again. And inside of their heads, you know, perhaps there are all these other kinds of fantasies. Now, the artist says that when she, in making this work, she's not intending it as a kind of expose of terrible working conditions, but simply wants to look at the situation from multiple realities. But as a number of commentators have pointed out, there's a very interesting irony involved in the title. The title, as I mentioned, is Whose Utopia, with a question mark. And what it seems to be talking about is the fact that, you know, one of the last communist countries, of course this was supposed to be the workers' paradise, is now, in fact, a capitalist paradise, which, you know, survives because of inexpensive, one could even argue, slave labor, minimal regulation, and socially conditioned submission. And it's interesting because actually just before I came here, I was reading an article in the New York Times about Steve Jobs and the factory where some of the glass for the Apple computers were made in China. And they talked about the reason that he had moved everything to China was in China he could have a workforce that lived in dormitories that worked 6 days a week. They had one day off, 12 hours a day. They got $14 a day. And they, you know, could be called upon when suddenly he wanted all of the Apple screens changed. They could be rousted out of bed and made to work basically 24 hours a day to produce this thing without you know, any kind of union interference. And so it's clear that, you know, yes, the arguments often made, these jobs have moved to China, we shouldn't object because it's making the lives of people better there. But in fact, there's been growing unrest in China that is very similar to the kind of labor unrest that took place in the West last century. So it's almost like they're sort of replicating that same history. So the question then is, where do artists fit into this story? In the works that I've shown up to now, basically the artists, as I said, are kind of seen, they work as sort of observers of this alien world of labor. And there's always been a kind of interesting, I think, tension between artists and, kind of laborers, which flares up periodically. There's the sense of artists as kind of elitist and privileged people on the one side, and then the artists themselves kind of thinking of themselves as being aligned with labor or somehow, having the same sorts of conflicts. And it resolves itself in different kinds of ways. I mean, Diego Rivera obviously was talking about the artist in solidarity with labor, and that was sort of the point of those murals and the point of much of his work. In the 1970s, another moment of kind of solidarity or attempted solidarity, there was a short-lived group called the Art Workers Coalition in New York. It was a group of artists who came together to protest the policies of the museums, particularly the Museum of Modern Art, and to demand that artists be given more control over their work and the sale of their work and the display of it. They wanted to address the unequal representation of women and minorities in the museums, and they also were protesting, as you can see here, this is the Vietnam War, and here they are in front of Guernica with, these are anti-Vietnam War posters. And part of the point here was, I think, that they wanted to see themselves as being part of and very much in sympathy with kind of the world of labor, to the extent that in 1970 they led a strike at MoMA, and they picketed outside the museum, and they, I think do I have a picture of that? Let's see. Yeah, here, this is also, yeah, from that time, demanding that the museum be much more aware of their conditions as workers. Now, interestingly, in spring of 2000, so not too long ago, there was another strike at MoMA. And this was a strike, actually, of the workers, both the lower-level curatorial workers and also the people in the more, I guess, the janitorial, the other sort of not exalted functions of the museum. And they were striking for better benefits, particularly health care. And one of the things that was interesting, they didn't close the museum, but they really they picketed in front of it for, I think, about 2 months, and they kept people from coming in, and people who felt in solidarity. So the museum was kind of a ghost town while that was going on. And one of the things that was very interesting to me was what came out was that even like some of the lower level curators, and you would think, okay, so the maintenance staff is not making very much money, but even curators, entry-level curators, were making about $20,000 a year, which in New York is, of course, not anywhere near enough to live on, at a time when the director of the museum, Glenn Lowry, who is, it turns out, the best paid museum director in the world, was making $1.6 million. So it was a kind of replication of exactly what's been going on now in terms of Occupy Wall Street and sort of pointing out this huge income gap in the United States. And I don't have an image of this, but just 2 weeks ago, the Occupy Wall Street movement, which has been sort of moved out of the park that they were occupying, is continuing to do different actions, and there's actually an art committee. And the art committee started a Occupy Museums movement, and they went to the Museum of Modern Art with a banner that said, "We are the 99%. And they were, one of the things that they were protesting is the fact that the Museum of Modern Art works with Sotheby's, and Sotheby's, the art house, is currently in a dispute with many of its art handlers, again, over issues of kind of wages and benefits. So again, these things don't seem to go away. But despite this kind of effort, I think, of artists to sort of see themselves as part of this world of labor, in certain ways it seems disingenuous. And this brings me to Santiago Sierra. Because one of the things that I think is behind his work is that these days artists are really not so much identified with the workers, the factory workers, the maintenance workers, the service workers, as they are with the manager, the entrepreneur, or even the factory owner, which is why, and I won't talk I'm going to just show quickly some of his work, and I urge you to go if you haven't seen the exhibition. But which is why so much of his work involves paying people, often sort of, people on the margins of society, minimum wage to do distasteful tasks. Because part of what he's sort of pointing out is that there's a class divide in the art world as well. And it's something that is often ignored and yet is very much something that he feels needs to be made visible. So just to run through a few, and you can go and see these videos in the museum. This is actually a piece that was a performance that was again at this show at Mass MoCA, The Workers, in which he had these Iraqi war veterans. He paid them minimum wage to stand in a corner for hours in the exhibition, not doing anything, not saying anything, while the kind of normal museum goers walked around, looked at the exhibition. So, of course, here he's talking about the way in which in the United States, when the veterans come back after serving in this war and often, in horrendous conditions, come back to a country that really doesn't seem to have a place for them and wants to ignore them, and part of the point of the work is also that these people are willing to take these kind of demeaning jobs for this minimum wage, because that's really all that's being offered to them right now. Another work of his that you can see, this is a work in which prostitutes are paid with heroin to allow their backs to be tattooed with a continuous horizontal line. And again, one of the things that it points out is this notion that, first of all, that the artist as a kind of, manager, factory owner, entrepreneur, and his relationship to his raw material here are people who are willing to do these sort of strange and demeaning things for, in this case, not even for money, but for heroin, a shot of heroin. This is a work called Laborers Who Cannot Be Paid, Remunerated to Remain in the Interior of Cardboard Boxes. And here, it was a work in which you see here the box being laid over this worker. These are undocumented workers, many of them political exiles, who are unable to obtain papers and therefore cannot obtain work. So again, willing to do this for minimum wage, and just what you saw then actually in the exhibition, and which you'll see in the video, is just these boxes for hours and hours in the museum. And this is a work, Iraqi immigrants lined up in an art gallery and sprayed on their backs with polyurethane, which then hardens and then they come out. And again, it's talking about the invisibility of this group of people, many of them, again, political refugees, who have no place in the society that they came from and no longer have a place in our society, and again sort of are willing to be covered up, and this becomes again a metaphor for this sort of cover-up of these sort of unpleasant social facts. So Sierra's way of dealing with the issue of art and labor is to talk about the otherwise hidden power relations that keep workers invisible under capitalism, and also to implicate the art world in that, and to talk about how the art world, which often pretends to be a world apart, is in fact deeply implicated in all of these sort of larger inequities as well. Now, I want to turn now to several other artists who are also talking about sort of the way in which artists and the art world are implicated, but in different ways. Part of what I think a lot of artists today are wrestling with is the very peculiar kind of position that they have in the economic world. And there's a word for it, which is precarity, which means sort of a kind of precariousness. And it's a word that's often been applied particularly to low-wage workers who have no protections, who have no retirement, in the United States, no health care, are basically just holding on by their fingernails. But it's a term that can also be used to talk about information workers. And this is, I think, a thing that a number of artists have sort of turned to talking about. Because what's happened is in the new digital economy, there's a new kind of so-called knowledge worker. And the idea here is that the knowledge worker owns, you know, his or her own means of production, meaning their brain, their creativity, and that they use this then, you know, to produce for themselves an income and a way of life. But the problem is, and I think artists are finding this, is that in certain ways they have a lot in common with the low-wage workers, because what they've ended up doing is exchanging, you know, what used to be the prerogatives of labor, things like lifetime employment, guaranteed benefits, economic security, and they've given these up for autonomy, self-direction, flexibility, etc., and the notion you get to work for yourself. And one of the, you know, kind of things that's becoming clear is that artists have been in the vanguard of sort of glamorizing this kind of you know, kind of non-affiliated work. And that suits, in fact, you know, sort of the corporate world very well, because then, you know, they sort of are able to argue that this is, you know, this is cool, this is glamorous, and you know, not giving you any benefits, you know, is actually in your interest, because you are owning your own means of production and you are in charge. But meanwhile, you know, if you get sick, you're really in trouble. So a number of artists have been kind of playing around these sets of ideas, and one of them, who I find very interesting, is Mika Rottenberg, who is a Israeli-born artist who lives now in the United States, in New York. And she does, again, videos. As I said, most of the artists I'm dealing with here are video artists, which is sort of interesting. She does these very elaborate videos, which are basically sort of parodies of assembly line production. And in these kind of complicated setups, and they go on for quite a while, and I'll try to describe them, although they're really, you can see some of them online actually, and they're pretty amazing. But she's using as a metaphor for the artist, the entrepreneur and the factory owner, and she's talking about how art gains value, and it's basically a kind of satirical reinterpretation of Marxist theory of labor and value and how an object gets labor. And here, what she's interested again in this sort of notion of how do people become their own means of production. So she tends to use female actors, and she advertises for women who have various kind of physical peculiarities here. This woman, for example, is very large. Some are very tall. They have different physical peculiarities, which they actually use and make a living off of in various kinds of ways. And she hires them to be workers in these kind of elaborate scenarios in which commodities are produced through the manipulation of bodily processes and fluids, okay, which sounds very bizarre. But for example, this is a work called Dough. And the idea here is, okay, this woman here, her tears, she cries, her tears go through the floor. Here you see sort of this process. Here here she is sort of crying here. So they go through the floor to sort of dough. They're heated up. It makes the dough rise, and then this extremely tall woman sort of pulls the dough kind of through these holes, and then it's baked. So it's through these kind of bodily processes, you know, and of course a lot of it is sort of faked, but it's sort of plausible. These bodily processes then create this commodity, which is dependent on, you know, kind of their own means of production, their body as their own means of production. Another one, this is one called Squeeze. This is very elaborate too. And also, well, in this one and in some of the more recent ones, she's also kind of doing a kind of parody of the globalized kind of market and the globalized world of work. So here, this is a very elaborate system which uses real sweatshops in India, Mexican migrant workers, Chinese masseuses, and they're put together through the magic of video so that it seems like they're all in the same place, even though they're actually filmed in all of these different places. And they create an object which combines latex, lettuce, and blush. The whole thing is managed by this, again, a large Buddha-like woman on a turntable who is, the conceit is giving directions by telekinesis. So, for example, here, so you see here's the Indian workers, and they have these holes in the ground. So then they put their hands through the holes, and then you see the hands coming through here, and the Chinese masseuses are giving them a massage. Here you see these butts. The butts, I forget where the butts are supposedly coming from, but they're all part of the process. And here's the blush, here's the lettuce, here is sort of this tongue that kind of comes through at one point, I forget exactly why. And then the final product here is this compressed cube of blush and lettuce. This is Mary Boone, the artist, the dealer. And so now it has become an artwork. This thing has become an artwork. And in fact, she has sold shares in this artwork and then has placed it in a vault. So God only knows what's happening to it in the vault. And it now then is something, it is an artwork of sort of official conferred value, created through these bodily processes. And a third piece of hers, this is a moving into kind of live performance. This is a piece that she did for Performa this fall in New York City, and it's working along a similar way. And in this work, there were live aspects, and then there were also videoed aspects, and they were sort of seamlessly timed together so that the whole thing really seemed to be, happening in real time. So to try to explain what's going on here. Okay, here, this is the transcontinental production of quote-unquote chakra juice, which is a magic elixir distilled from human sweat, which comes in 7 colors ascribed in Indian medicine to the body's 7 force centers. So what happens is the sweat is harvested from performers. Here's one of the performers, and this was happening in real time when you went into this room. And this guy, there was a kind of little closed-in, glassed-in kind of place with this apparatus, and successive performers would come and they would sweat. Then the sweat was sort of picked up through this sort of tubes. Here by this woman who was sort of the chemist, and this was also in real time with this very kind of elaborate operation here, and she would then put it into the tubes, and then she would send it, out of our vision, and then there would be a video which seemed to show you it arriving in Africa. And then, again, I guess something was done to it in Africa, and then it was sent back. But in the end, it finally ends up back in Africa, and the whole thing ends with this sort of dramatic display of fireworks. So it was quite an interesting video. But again, kind of, it's a very playful look at the notion of labor, but also, talking about serious issues, globalization, kind of transformation, how value is made, what are the raw materials, what do workers have to offer? In this case, perhaps only, the processes of their own body. Oh, and here, here's the elixir, the final elixir here. Okay, and so the last artist that I want to talk about is Stephanie Rothenberg, who is a young woman who works, and she lives in upstate New York, but she works on the web. She's very interested in Second Life. Now, Second Life is a virtual world. Some of you may kind of have experimented with it, but it's a virtual world which sort of replicates the systems of our world. And it has, there are activities. It has its own currency, which is called the linden, which actually, if you work or you play, things cost lindens, or you acquire them, and you can actually translate them into U.S. dollars at a certain point at the rate of 270 lindens to a single U.S. dollar. And so it's a very kind of interesting, sort of elaborate world that many many people have gotten involved in, and it has, as I say, it sort of replicates all the functions of our world. And she's been playing with it, especially to talk about issues of labor. And one of the things that she uses it to point out is that one of the things that's happened in now, going back to the notion of the net slave, is that basically we have lost any distinction between leisure and work. I mean, if you think about how, with the electronic devices that we have now, it's almost impossible to get away from them. And then, even when people are going into leisure mode, often it involves these electronic devices. It involves, for many people, people who go into Second Life, they're then working again. They're off their real job and they're working again in Second Life. So there's this kind of weird blurring that's happened between work and leisure, which again, can be very useful for those, who are trying to extract, surplus value from their workers. The other thing that she points to here is that there's a disappearance of the distinction between the virtual and the real, in the sense that in Second Life, for example, some players can make some significant real life first world, they call it, there's Second Life and First Life money, using sort of doing things and I'll explain sort of how that could be done here in a minute. And also that some of the simulations that happen in Second Life are actually used for First Life purposes. So, for example, to make it a little clearer, the image I just showed you, and this image, this is from a piece of hers called Invisible Threads. And this is a virtual sweatshop that hires Second Life workers. So she advertises on Second Life, and she gets workers, and she pays them 200 lindens an hour, which is about 80 cents in U.S. currency, to create jeans. Now, the interesting thing is that the jeans are actually ordered by First Life people. Here you see some of them appearing here, up here in this screen. So they put their measurements into Second Life. These workers then create this, they do this whole thing. We'll get some other images here. And then what comes out then is kind of this template, which then can be cut out and used to make these jeans. And the jeans themselves cost $35 in, First Life currency. So what's interesting about it is that, she's using what would be by First Life basis, kind of very underpaid Second Life workers to create First Life profits. So it's a very interesting sort of complex thing, and makes one wonder whether this is the template for the future. One here, here again is more of this factory, and there's some of the jeans you can see here. Okay, a second project that she did is called the School of Perpetual Training. And these are it's an ironic instructional training program. And the purpose of it actually is to reveal the exploitation of poorly paid immigrant labor in the computer video game industry. Because part of her point was that, people think, oh, that must be so glamorous to work as a video game designer and in that world. But in fact, there are lots of kind of not so glamorous things that have to be done. And these things are done by, real First Life immigrants who are being paid almost nothing to do things like mineral mining, printed circuit board assembly, building of boxes, and shipping. So what you do with it, this whole kind of, again, a kind of training program, and you go through it all and you decide, which of the areas you want to be in. And here you can see, of course, there's lots of it, of hazards, work hazards, etc. And when the whole thing is done, here's another person here, kind of involved in doing this. When the whole thing is done, you realize that, again, sort of the amount of money that you made as a kind of, again, this is real life. the amount of money that the game designer made and the amount that the CEO made are kind of wildly disproportionate. So it becomes a way, again, of sort of talking about, these huge inequities in our system. And then finally, she did a series of Second Life portraits. And these are works that, in which she went to people who are players in Second Life and who have in Second Life, they have a job, they have created for themselves a job that is similar to their first life job. Now, as you can see, they're all very glamorous because in Second Life, you can make yourself look like anybody or anything. So, this is your avatars, and so people get to, kind of be the fantasy person they always wanted to be. What she does in these portraits, then, is to talk about this very peculiar sort of relationship that these people have between first and Second Life, which also, I think, begins to reveal things about kind of the nature of labor generally today. So for example, this avatar is called Constance Nightingale. And in real life, she's a maternity nurse. And in Second Life, she's a maternity nurse and the owner of a virtual maternity center that provides pregnancy packages for other avatars and delivers virtual babies. But what's interesting about this is that it's a very successful maternity center, and so she employs 10 part-time virtual nurses and receptionists, and she actually makes, in real First Life, US dollar money, $300 to $400 a week. So she's actually able to translate this into real money in the real world. Although she does report that rent in Second Life is getting to be very expensive and starting to cut into her profit. Another example, this is Frankly All Right. In real life, he's a 3D modeler and architect. In Second Life, he owns a virtual architecture studio that designs commercial and residential architecture for both the physical and the virtual worlds. And that's very interesting, the way he sort of plays back and forth, because apparently what happens here is when he makes designs for virtual customers in Second Life, and he charges them $25 to $30 real money each. But he also does kind of prototyping for real customers in the real world, and for them he gets between $30,000 and $50,000 US dollars. And one of the things that she notes here is that he reports to her that the recession has seen a decline in the virtual demand, so he's not getting as much virtually, but in fact, real life prototyping, I think because it's cheaper than having real people do it, has actually gone through the roof, and so he's making a lot of money doing, in Second Life, doing prototyping for real life. Now, I don't pretend to totally understand how this works, but this is what she reports. Okay, this is an avatar called, and her name is Informatics Applebaum. In real life, she's a university librarian and information technologist. In Second Life, she's a museum docent. And what's interesting here is that, in fact, her Second Life job is part of her First Life job. She's in fact, this is what she has to do, and it's part of her duties. And so she doesn't get any kind of real monetary advantage from this. But people can go online, and she will give them education and information about these actual real museums. And what's happened for her, what she's noticed, is that the budget cuts in real life institutions are causing a boom in virtual education. So she's got her avatar is in fact much busier than she is in real life. And finally, just to let you know that it's not all work in Second Life. This is SweetMuffin Lane, who is in real life a telemarketer and virtual call center person, and in Second Life is a personal escort. And you can imagine what he's up to. But again, he reports that he's able to work with other social networks, Facebook and various other social networks, who use Second Life to enhance the virtual experience of virtual sex. And he notes also that pole dancing in his line of work is a must. So that is some of the things that we have to look forward to in the new kind of virtual world of labor. But just to conclude here, what's clear from this little kind of survey, I think, is that, that there's long been a kind of myth about artists having autonomy and freedom from the mundane world of work. And that's why there's always been, I think, this kind of strange tension between workers and artists. But all of that has sort of been battered by postmodernism, by many different things, globalism, the recession, lots of things, so that artists no longer have the luxury of considering that the art world and they themselves are outside of the world of work. And in fact, as the various, I think, projects that I've shown here reveal, they find that they are both at times the victim and the victimizers in this new world of labor. And I thought I would just end with a quote from Santiago Sierra that addresses that notion. Of course, with his work has been highly controversial in certain circles, and he's often asked about sort of the ethics of his practice, what it means, for him to basically, is he exploiting these people who he's paying minimum wage to do these kind of very distasteful jobs? And this is what he says about that, which I think is very interesting. He says, "At the moment, I do the work of an interior decorator or an organizer of exclusive events for the cultural elite. What I do is refuse to deny the principles that underlie the creation of an object of luxury. From the watchman who sits next to a Monet for 8 hours a day, to the doorman who controls who comes in, to the source of the funds used to buy the collection. And when you put your name on the work, it seems that you're held responsible for the capitalist system itself." So, thank you.